When we hear the word interactive, it's easy to immediately think about technology or the way we interface with it. But interactivity begins with humans and is in fact an extension of the gestures, spontaneity, and engagement we use to gather an understanding of the world around us. Ideally, the addition of technology to these interactions will enhance our knowledge and feed our natural tendency to create stories that make sense of our surroundings. When we apply these principles to experience design, what is the ideal balance of technological novelty and more analog forms of interactivity? Can we create more meaningful engagement by not letting technology get in the way of the narrative? Welcome back to the Tide Generator podcast. I'm your host, Kirsten Nelson. You know, lately it seems like we're getting all of our stories through technological devices, but in reality, humans really like to gather their narratives through interaction with the environment and the people around them. So as we continue to evolve experience design and we try to consider what might come next as we are now even more reliant on technology with current limitations, let's think about how we might create a better balance between the technological devices that help with storytelling and the more analog ways we interact with the world around us. So here with me to talk about that are my esteemed guests, Toshi Hoo, Director of the Emerging Media Lab with the Institute for the Future. Hello, hi.
Hello, Kirsten.
Hello. And Sundar Raman, he is Director of Technology with the Museum of the Future. Hi.
Hello.
Hi. Yeah, thanks both of you for joining us from the future and of the future and about the future. So yeah, when we talk about that, you both spend a lot of time thinking about technology and its role in what we keep calling the future. But really the future is the present. And we're trying to think about all the ways that we've been predicting the way we're going to use different ways of interacting via technology. But we're also constantly seeing that storytelling is the way that we, do make sense of the world, as you've both talked about fairly often. So I guess, kind of diving right into it, how can we create a better balance between technology and the more analog ways that we make sense of the world around us?
This is a question that Institute for the Future has been thinking about since its inception back in 1968, when the organization was a spinoff of the RAND Corporation, and it was some of the early scientists and social scientists looking at the impact of the internet. Initially, as many people know, the internet was our ARPANET. It was really primarily for the military and the academic world. And the founders of IFTF said, wait a minute, this might have larger implications outside of those two narrow applications. Let's see how this is going to impact society at large. And really that was kind of the origin story of IFTF. And although we have a number of labs at the Institute looking at everything from the future of food to future of health, kind of the central question in many of these labs and a lot of the research is really like, what is the impact on humanity of distributed networks and really communication systems? So even though my lab does focus a lot on communications and collaboration and human connection, really that's a theme throughout the entire institute. And, it's arguably true that, and I think part of why I've focused so much of my career on looking at communications is communications technology is kind of the instigating technology that helps all of our other innovations and transformations as human society. It's really what has allowed us to evolve to a kind of collective entity across this planet and do all the amazing and kind of crazy things that humans do. So in some ways, communication technology is what allows us to transcend the individual, right? And a lot of the work that we do and a lot of kind of the basis of my career in working in emerging media technologies has been looking, like, how do you look at beyond the novelty factor of what this new thing is, right? And what are the transformational aspects of this technology? And my kind of approach to that has been throughout my career to look at the affordances, like what are the capabilities of this technology that are different than previous technologies. And then if you look at those new affordances as metaphors, and then you understand that stories are essentially a collection of metaphors, and they're the way that we map out and do the sense making, as you mentioned, of our reality, our experience as an individual with a consciousness, our experience as a social entity, our experience in a physical world, and then our experience dealing with kind of the mystery and the unknown, kind of the four functions of mythology. How do new technologies transform the kind of conversations we can have, and also who can have those conversations? We've seen democratization of media, especially in the electronic age, which has really transformed things. And I think a lot of the early folks at IFTF were kind of, in some ways, on the side of, I would say, techno-utopians, in the sense of the Silicon Valley believed okay, we're going to, the internet is going to kind of make everything better. In some ways it has, right? But we've, particularly the last 5 to 10 years, we've started to see what are the downsides of that, particularly where, you have sense making and then you have sense breaking, right? So that's kind of how we think about it a lot, is not just, okay, what is this technology? What can it do? But more what does it do to us? And more specifically, how does it transform the kind of conversations we can have, and what kind of stories that we can even tell?
Wow. Well, Kirsten, firstly, thanks for inviting me to this, especially from the future, because I'm at least 9 hours in the future from you guys. So very much,
it looks good there. Yeah.
It's so far. It's so much better over here.
It seems like it. I can't wait.
Well,
I'm going to set my timer now.
Yeah, absolutely. There's on this question of the digital to the analog and communications, everything you said, Toshi, is what exactly I wanted to say. So,
sorry.
Devastating.
But one of the most common questions that I get asked as the director of technology of the Museum of the Future is whether that term is anachronistic or just an oxymoron, even whether it is completely problematic to have a museum of the future. And the way that I reconcile it, and I think this is actually accurate, is that museums are the mechanism by which we codify and archive our stories, our narratives. So for me, the future is something that we have always talked about. I think every culture has an aspect of what it considers the future, where it is aspiring towards. I mean, there's always the origin story and the hero's journey, right? You're always looking out to what you're doing, even in those cultures who actually consider the future as something behind them. But what's sort of interesting about this concept of the Museum of the Future is that we, as a technophiliac culture today, are no different from technophiliac cultures of the past. It used to be like a sword or a book or a stick, something I found and it was okay, this piece of technology is the thing that I want to carry forward. And the mechanism of communicating that piece of technology has always been the thing that we try to do. And then we create narratives around that. There's this idea of even, where communication really starts. And in the book, I'm going to completely butcher the author's name, but Information or Communications, you guys, James Gleig's book. He tells this narrative of the drum communication and how that is a mechanism for storytelling. And it was a way of communicating the common story, even though the telegraph was there, and it was able to communicate the common story much faster than any other technology. And I saw a piece at the Museum of Science and Industry in London, where there's a video of a community in Cameroon that still uses drum, the log and drum based communication in the age of the cell phone, because they realized that some of these ways of telling the story of the community are far more effective than the one-to-one communication. And the kind of point in that is that in all of these, we have to grow up to figure out how to tell how to use that technology to tell our stories. Like it took a very long time for us to understand the value of paper. It took a very long time for us to understand the value of the book. And today, like we're so nascent in the value of the internet. I mean, it's been around for 40 years. And truly, globally, it's been around for roughly 3 weeks. Like satellite communications just starting to happen. We have things like Instagram and WhatsApp and all this. But, it's funny to see the prevalence of things like WhatsApp in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, and none of my friends in the US use WhatsApp. And you go, how is it possible that something that we think of a communication medium has such disparity in usage? And it's because we haven't come up with like a common language of even how to use it. So for me, that transition from, like the digital to the analog is how do we normalize technology to start telling our stories using it rather than making it the endpoint, and it's an interesting evolution that we go through, and I think we have a lot of space to grow into it.
Yeah, that's the whole crux of the entire question, I guess, right? Is how do we use these devices in a way that's meaningful and in a way that communicates broadly, in fact, broadcasts, the messages
Right.
that need to be shared, but how do we not get lost in that? And how do we get back to that hero's journey? I know that that Toshi, you're often talking about the embodied cognition theory and all of this, like where does the human fit into this, and how do we gather things from around us? I guess, how does that fit into this puzzle, do you think?
Well, a lot of the research in our lab over the last couple of years has focused on XR technologies, virtual reality and augmented reality. And there's a number, earlier I talked about like what are the different affordances, and one of the really dramatic differences of these kind of technologies is that they're embodied. You have an embodiment in these experiences, and that's a very different paradigm than the kind of removed observer that is kind of the traditional media experience. I mean, even though I'm interacting with you now, there's this kind of sense of windowedness and separation, this flatness essentially. So we have been very interested, again, like looking at kind of applying this methodology. So let's say, okay, what are the differences here in this kind of the storytelling you could do before, and what are some new stories you could tell? Previously, before I was working in VR, I was working in immersive filmmaking. So where you're using like dome projection technology to give yourself a enclosed, encompassed, surround experience. And really, one of the big differences there. So, like, how do we shift these metaphors from the removed observer sitting alone in the dark, staring at a windowed experience, to something that not only am I immersed in, but now I'm embodied in this experience. And just to kind of cover the theory of embodied cognition is really challenging the notion that we just think with our brains. The idea kind of that embodied cognition introduces is that we think with our bodies, we think socially, and we actually think with our environments. It's much more relational. It's much more holistic understanding of consciousness and cognition. And I think it's a much more interesting kind of map of how we actually think. So, how do we apply this kind of question then in our work? Well, the idea is, I don't think there's any lack of coincidence in the fact that in some ways we've used these kind of incredible, flat, relatively low dimensional communication platforms and systems over the last 50 years to do amazing things, but we've been kind of disembodied in our collective thinking here. And I think it's no coincidence that we've kind of built a world that's increasingly uninhabitable for our bodies. And so we're very interested in the idea of as we bring our embodied selves into our collaboration spaces, how does that transform the type of thinking, the values, the considerations, the kind of design focus when we work in these kind of spaces.
Can I ask you something, Coach Toshi? So, sorry, can I jump in for a second there, Kirsten?
You sure can. Spontaneity, we're all missing it. Just go with it.
I'm really not missing spontaneity.
Okay, well, you're lucky.
I was thinking, how do you feel about the evolution of how we have communicated. Like, I mean, there's an immediacy to the technology that we have today of, even any kind of XR implementation. But for me, the original XR was the written word on the democratization of writing, because people had to even come up with the language. Like, what are the adjectives that you use to describe your environment to somebody who has never been there? And do you think that there's sort of a parallel there to us even trying to come up with a vocabulary? Because we so far are trying to emulate everything around us instead of coming up with a new vocabulary to put XR into the context of this thing that you're saying, this texturization of the environment,
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, if you look at consciousness and cognition, I mean, at the bottom of it all is patterns, right? How do we have shared patterns? And in some ways, you could kind of describe reality. If nothing else, it has to be shared, right? It's the sense of that we are recognizing patterns, and there's similarities, and that we can kind of find resonance in those. That's how we use language. And yeah, it's correct. I mean, when you go back to looking at something like the written word, I mean, when you're studying things where you're actually able to simulate the visualizations and sound of being somewhere, there's kind of a specificity to that, right? And actually, there's we've been looking at some of the downsides of that, right? The immersion of reading a good book is partially because it's stimulating your mind and your imagination is filling in so much. And that, this being able to simulate all of that stimulus isn't necessarily an evolution, right? It's an interesting new space to do things. And particularly the ability to be explicit with our imaginations in ways that weren't possible before. But I mean, one of the first things you notice when you start looking at kind of perceptual science and perceptual cognition is that, this idea that we are seeing things as they are, we're sensing all this information and we make sense of it in our minds is really pretty flawed. What we really are mostly doing is taking in lots of information, throwing almost all of it away, and retaining the things that match our previous patterns. And so that's why I think a good book or a good VR experience is one that has enough kind of commonality and recognition, familiarity of patterns that we know, but is always stretching them in ways that we haven't thought of before. Obviously my bias is really towards like transformational experiences. I think there's also a lot of value in communication that brings ideas forward and just, traditions and things like this. But I think this idea of revitalizing our mythology is ongoing to match not only our new observational tools and our understandings of the world, but kind of the current needs of survival. I mean, that's another kind of basic theory that I have, is that storytelling is like food in that the function of stories is survival. And we've lost that in the same way we've lost that understanding around food, is that food has become entertainment and kind of status signaling and, culture also. But in a lot of ways, we've lost that sense of because there's so much abundance. And I think the same thing is with story today. It's hard for us to imagine lack of abundance of story. And that's one of the kind of the fallouts of the internet, right? Is we have so many stories. It's hard to know. I mean, and that's great. We have more opportunities to understand ourselves in the world. But we also have many conflicting ideas. I mean, we're seeing the kind of political fallout of that in the United States right now.
Right. But there's also this interesting thing of how the stories, I always think of the most recent form of mythology as the comic book. I think my superheroes were the equivalent of gods of another generation or religion of another generation. And what's interesting is that narrative mechanism has been absorbed in a lot of cultures now, so that their own paths of those stories are now coming out. There was a homogenization that happened for a little while. And what's fascinating now is I think almost that tool has come to fruition, where people are able to tell their own stories in their own ways using that narrative mechanism. The same thing is previously it was okay, we need to tell the story of religion even for those cultures that didn't proselytize, because that was the mechanism to promote the culture. And they went, okay, I need a religion, or to poorly paraphrase Eddie Izzard, I need my flag, like everyone has to have their flag. And so now you come up with your book, even though you never had a book before that. And so now everyone has a superhero that is part of their cultural idiom to kind of fit into this paradigm. And I wonder if we're not finally, we did have a dearth of those narratives, the hero's journeys, or there was the variation in those hero's journeys. And now we're starting to see that it's coming back up, very similar to food. And I actually disagree with you in that I think we are much more texturized towards food recently. It's not just about hipsterization. I think we hipsterize food because we are so hungry for the texture and like that variation. And we actually do it to fulfill our souls, not just for the Soylent type nourishment, Right.
It's true. Yeah. Culture is so important and identity is so critical.
Yeah.
I think you bringing up superheroes. I mean, clearly not only are we seeing the emergence of the superhero story, but the flawed superhero, right? I mean, kind of like the X-Men the dying X-Men, right? Like the mortality of a god, right? And I think that's an incredibly resonant story and kind of a revitalization of the god myth right now. Yeah. Last year, actually, and you attended our annual research summit, and last year the theme was kind of like the age of superpowers, but there was a little bit of a twist to that, right? Which is we are simultaneously at the most powerful moment. We have the powers of gods. We can fly and see around the world, and in some ways travel through time, right? But yet we're also at the most kind of fragile moment as well. And what is that metaphor? What is that story here? Like, how do you the classic Spider-Man story of like, how do you resolve that you have so much power and are you able to wield it in a way that not only doesn't destroy your world, but destroy yourself, right?
Right. And that is the God stories of a lot of cultures, right? I mean, the Greeks and the Hindus and whoever else was like, the gods are super flawed. They're definitely, they may be omniscient on one level, but they're complete idiots on another, So.
Yeah, there's a lot of deception and cheating and, banishment in all of our myths, right? And in a way that's kind of proof of what you're talking about of, how we codify cautionary tales in the myth making and in technology, right? Where these are things that we've passed down for survival in that way. What can we learn from this story that may or may not be true, but we all believe it and we all tend to the instructions we're getting from those stories. And I think that's kind of what's interesting about both of your work in creating experiences is you do look back at how narrative has always imparted the knowledge we need to go forward. And I guess that's kind of what I find interesting is, how when we're trying to create the narrative arc, because we know as humans, the narrative arc hasn't changed a lot. We do like with regular frequency, some sort of dose of adrenaline or some kind of dopamine rush. And I guess, is that something you have to plan for? That's some way that in many ways technology can provide that, right? When you need to get somebody's attention back into a story, there's maybe a moment where you can use the technology to make that happen. I mean, how are you making narrative arc that matches the way humans like to absorb stories?
Yeah, in my specific case, I think we grapple with this a lot, because I do think that there is one narrative arc that we think works, or it has worked a little bit over the last at least few decades, because we're able to see from like pop culture that there's a response cycle to it, or with social media and whatever else. But I don't know that it is universal. I actually think that there are a lot of different mechanisms to what those hits are, and there are a lot of different depths. I do think that there's the ease of certain paths that we could just get lazy and just go down we'll make you fearful or excited or whatever it is. But then you actually read mythologies from around the world, and they're so diverse. Like even fairy tales, there are fairy tales from countries that just do not have the moralistic arc that we are potentially used to. And we start normalizing it because we think, oh, everyone does work. Like the hero's journey, for example. That's very much only one set of myths that work that way. The hero in other cases is not quite so distinct. The hero dies like early on, and then you go, wait, what am I? What is the story here? And they go, no, that's life. It's like, everyone dies. It's okay. And we have to kind of get to that point where we accept that. So, but in a specific case of how interactions work with this, I personally grapple with it because I go, like, in a place like Dubai, we have so many cultures that are trying to come together. And Toshi, you and I had these conversations over lunch as well. It's like, how do you grapple with so many real cultures simultaneously interacting and also coming together for a very specific dopamine rush, which is like this capitalistic economy here. And also everyone bring their own cultural, identities into this, and all of that being kept alive in a way. I mean, there's not like a sense of I need to assimilate here. And yet we have to tell stories around this so that it makes sense to everyone, I feel confused even talking about it, but I hope I'm conveying some of this, what we grapple with.
Yeah, I think what you made me think of there is there are variations in the way we pick up narrative, and like you said, there's a lot of different ways we gather stories, and you maybe think too of the factor of time and how much that's changed even in our lifetime. Of a 90-minute feature film was a standard arc for a while. We understood first, second, third act moments of drama and conflict and how each scene had a plus or minus. But now that's condensed to these 20-second, little TikTok moments. And so it's interesting to even think about that, how we consume things and what we can gather in different amounts of time. And now this intergenerational thing you have to address too with these experiences. People who walk in and will glance for 2 seconds and get something that someone else needs 30 minutes to absorb. So I guess that's another factor.
There's another thing that we grapple with in Dubai a lot, which is the sense of vision is what a lot of places think of as interaction, just sense of vision and touch. In Dubai, so many spaces have specific smells, like very subtle, but there's a scent directive. And this is something, Toshi, I would even throw back at you of like, how does that get brought back into XR? Because we don't really leverage all of the other senses as much as we potentially could. It's like when you're in VR, you actually should get a special kind of chewing gum that changes, like elasticity changes over time, and it releases different flavors or something like this. And I know people have played around with that idea, but they haven't done enough with that, because we keep
that inspires me to share these. These are our scratch the future stickers that we included in our experience box for our conference this year. We basically built out, we call it the future readiness package, knowing that this for the first time ever, we were going to host the event virtually. There was a lot of kind of design principles went into it, but one of them was, how do we make this multisensory? So we had 5 days of items that were kind of secret mystery items that we would reveal in a morning ritual ceremony together. The last one was the Sniff the Future Day, and we put a variety of different smells in there that people could sniff, and we had a kind of experience where you would talk through like, what does it evoke for you? I think that's definitely one of the things we think about. I mean, in museums, I mean, my background also is in museum exhibit design, and thinking about how you kind of engage people in multisensory ways, and not just the 5 senses traditionally. I mean, even one of the other senses that we kind of manipulated too was time. So we were thinking about how do we change our sense of time. I think that's a larger challenge now more than ever, that we are so limited in our ability to gather physically and have kind of, as experienced designers, our control over all of those different channels. So a lot of the work that we did on our conference this year and used as an experiment was to figure out how do we kind of try to break through and open up more channels of communication and experience. But just to, I don't know if we have much time, but I want to go back to your other question about kind of thinking about the future and the dramatic arc. This is a challenge right now for anybody who's thinking about the future, is there's kind of infiltration of kind of dystopian Black Mirror effect futures, right? And one of the theories around that is that it's hard to tell just like a a story that's like, okay, then we did this and it was all great and everyone lived happily forever. That's, from within the kind of storytelling environment, that's not necessarily a gripping story. People like to see other people going through tension and trying to understand, how they get through that, right? See them in a vulnerable space and how they transcend and transform. And I think it's interesting, Sundar, that you mentioned kind of capitalism, as I do think that's one of the factors right here that for me and a lot of kind of folks thinking about the future is kind of the elephant in the room often. It's like, if all the futures we're imagining, like also continue to contain extractive capitalism, like what do all those endings kind of lead to, and especially when we're talking about technology, like I'm of the belief that technology is not kind of a neutral tool. I think it's an increasingly powerful amplifier of power. And, often, when we're thinking about the future, there too often, I think the folks in the room are people in places of power and often really connected to that capitalist extractive system. And we're seeing amplification of that. And unfortunately, it's increasingly understood as a dead end road for humanity and for kind of our survival on this planet. So I'm not saying free enterprise is a bad thing overall, but I think as a dominant force, it's kind of leading us down non-regenerative, non-sustainable routes. And so I think partially that's part of my personal theory of why we're seeing so many dystopian futures is like, if you look at a lot of the Black Mirror scenarios, it's often because like a company has come in there and they're kind of going towards those interests, not necessarily like the technology is being wielded to actually for the benefit of humanity and really like actual futures that we would all want to live in.
But funnily, like I'm actually seeing the counter to that, because I was actually afraid of how the corporatocracy was going to become more and more dystopian. And instead, I'm seeing a slightly more benevolent side to the humans that are running these corporations, or at least the very early ideas in that direction. I mean, like my sense of the future started off with things like Star Trek. And so maybe I was kind of twisted because that was a very utopian vision of the future. And then somehow, like shortly thereafter, everything became super dystopian. I mean, like you grow up with things like Fahrenheit 451 and Brave New World. And then Star Trek comes along and it's like, no, everything's cool. Like we have already figured out that we are doing things for the betterment of ourselves, for our spiritual growth. And maybe it takes that much time for us to start even believing in that narrative, right? Because I think Star Trek for me is one of the myths that that generation sort of internalized. And we had to tell that story to ourselves and go, actually, that's the reason that we are doing the things that we're doing. Those are the technologies that we want to bring to life. And we go, those are the sociological statements that we want to make in our communities as well. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, like I'm throwing that out as maybe an idea. And how do we put that into these contexts?
I would kind of categorize Star Trek as kind of an earlier incarnation of what's now kind of being coined as the solar punk movement. This like more harmonious vision of the future. And we've been tracking the solar punk movement, and it's fascinating. There's a lot of beautiful artwork and literary work happening in that space, but it has yet to catch on in the kind of broader popular culture. Like we're not seeing those kinds of stories being made. I'm not sure if it's because we're not ready for it yet, or if they're just not engaging stories. I'm not sure why.
But don't you think it has already taken off? Like, I mean, I see, for example, Nichelle Nichols and George Takei and Leonard Nimoy, like William Shatner became the guy who became reality. It's like he started off as like this crazy cartoony guy on the show, like overacting, and then he shows up as Iron Chef, and then like it's just like William Shatner did change the world, and it was like, wow, it's around me.
Are obviously those, not just the characters, but the people who play them have become iconic heroes for many folks. And I think you're right. But in some ways, I think Star Trek, was very provocative in the 60s when it came out, partially because it was pressing social issues. It was doing kind of speculative social fictions and saying like, well, what if like a Black person and a white person could work alongside each other and even kiss, and they kind of jumped to those speculative social features. in a lot of ways, they kind of leapfrogged a lot of kind of the economic issues in that, it's kind of like, well, let's just jump to when, there's no, there's like this kind of benevolent government for the most part, and everybody's kind of in alignment and we just do things together. And I think that isn't important. I mean, it is important to have those big leapfrog visions, but I think we're grappling now because the creation of the StarTAC communicator by Motorola was clearly inspired by that. But at the same time, those speculative fictions didn't anticipate the problems that we're now facing with our kind of democratized communication systems that we have today. So now we're grappling with those issues that weren't anticipated, I think, by those earlier, but in really important kind of visionary stories.
Right. Sorry, did we just go off on a tangent there?
No, but that's what the show is about. Tangents, always. Tangents are encouraged. Well, that just made me think, actually, and yeah, we do have to start to wrap up. But when we're talking about this more democratized version of storytelling, everyone is a content creator now. And you guys are talking simultaneously about the fact that storytelling does have power. Narrative has power to actually direct events and our perception and what we want and dream of next. And actually, yeah, Sundar, to your point, that something that was at the Institute for the Future's 10-year forecast summit this year was a talk by Yancey Strickler that actually simultaneously, it just made me really enthusiastic about the fact that, yeah, there are a lot of these like billionaire founders of technology companies that have sold their part of their business, and they're now coming together in the background to genuinely try to create something like powerful and positive. And again, it's utopian and dreamlike now, but now that I like that they're trying to apply their resources, knowledge, networks to try to change, and that to me, it showed the power and like maybe the story will change if we can start to hear them a little more in the narrative instead of fear mongering, but that's another tangent. But anyway, wrapping up, I think what that makes me think of is actually this question that we sort of talked a little bit about, was the notion of journeying together and how we can't do that now. But I know you've both talked about how in experience design, just the simple act of walking together through a space and everything that we gather from our perceptual, all of our thinking, our embodied thinking, I guess as we try to move forward and change the narrative in this time where we're missing that, I guess, how can we kind of use the tools we have now to bring back a notion of more of a collective journey like that? I don't know. What are you thinking is next?
I think this conversation around the collective journeying together, that was one of the kind of main insights and design principles that we've been applying towards our virtual experiences. You don't know what you have till it's gone, right? The deprivation really helps us understand what we took for granted before. There's so many things. I mean, case in point, like one of the things we observed in some of our events was just the power of chatter. To be in a space where there's other people talking, that you're not really following the conversation, but you're hearing the energy levels, you occasionally hear a word, you can see kind of how they're talking with each other, the cadence of their conversation. Like, this is a big part of sense making, and beyond just like reading a web page about how what's happening in the world, seeing how we other people are reacting and processing is such a huge part of human sense making, and it's one of the things that's kind of been turned off in a way. And sadly, I think in a time where I talked about the kind of amplification qualities of technology. One of the big problems that we have is that storytelling, we trust storytelling. We're wired to trust stories that seem powerful and that seem like other people are listening to, because the stories that have moved forward are theoretically the stories that have allowed people to survive and tell those stories. That's kind of like especially in the oral tradition, right? And now we're in a time where just because a story is like amplified and seems to be agreed upon by many people or very popular, it doesn't actually mean it contains survival knowledge. In fact, it can actually be the opposite. And so this is one of the big problems that we have, is that now, because we consume much of our information through the internet, we don't have that kind of ambient social processing that we might have. And this isn't just like in terms of parsing, like, what's happening politically. Like, I think even just like walking down the street together, we just don't really do that the way we have. So that was one of the things we tried to include in our conference that you attend, Kirsten, which is like we literally went on a different journey together. We whether that be through the streets of Taiwan or underwater drone journey that we went on one day, because we wanted to try to, like, in a way, both have that experience, but also kind of create a ritual to recognize just how important that is, right? And how deprived we are from that.
Yeah, I wonder about that a little bit, because my experience over the last few months has been quite different, strangely. I actually think that, like, I have had more connection with a lot of people that I felt distanced from thanks to COVID. Because, I mean, and that was just by virtue of my physically being separated from the people that I was really close to, you know? So this actually forced everyone to come online. I have had more dinners with Kirsten here than I had in New York, which is
very true.
Kind of sad. We were like, 20-minute train ride away.
We were so busy. We were so busy.
We're so busy. And it's a manufactured busyness, like I'm so busy, like all the time. Like it's total nonsense. Mm-hmm. But it's also an interesting time because it's the first time we really did go on a journey together. Like, in all of humanity, like, had to figure out what is this journey that we're on.
We're all facing this.
We're all facing it together. But I also wonder if we ever had this thing of like walking together and serendipity and all that. From an urban perspective, yes. But you think about how most of humanity was living prior to this, and it's like we were separated out. Yeah, you walk together with the person that you were with, like your partner or your friend or whatever. But even that was a minority. Most people were like logging their own tree and like building their own house and like trying to, find their own beaver to kill or whatever, But it's, it's like I feel like there's a sort of a nostalgic sense that we have of the village coming together and doing stuff. But largely that was a thing that people came together at different times. And for the most part, we lived a somewhat isolated existence. I mean, we were alone together kind of situation. Maybe or at least this is what it feels like to me. And that reality started coming back a little bit. And I think we have to come up with ways of making our current tools sort of more malleable, I think this sort of a thing, like a video-based approach, is not inherently bad, but we sort of haven't figured out how to make this good either. It's just been like, oh, let's throw up a bunch of boxes on the screen and figure out how to deal. Because that's just been like the first thing that we could do. We just haven't done any UX around it,
Oh yeah.
So
total hackathon right now. I couldn't agree more. It's one of the most incredible moments to be alive right now. Yeah. And I agree with your kind of observation. Like, I have connected with people and kind of intention, but there's a structuredness and an intentionality, which is not bad, but is very different than kind of like, and I know you may disagree with the serendipity side of things, but I think and this is one of the problems I have with Zoom and kind of the Zoom box, is like everything is so highly structured right now. Yeah. And I agree, like this part of it is just we're using tools for things that they were never really intended to do, like Zoom. Like, we're trying to put everything into Zoom right now. And I part of what we've been looking at is like, what are the kind of variations or the experiments beyond a Zoom experience? In fact, we didn't use any Zoom in our conference this year, and just partially to push ourselves to try other things and see what they would offer. But I totally agree that it's also one of the most connecting moments and most grounding moments, and people are being forced to spend time with their families for better or for worse. I'm getting to know my own neighborhood in ways that I haven't in 4 years since I've been here. And I agree, we're also been pushed on a collective moment that is what kind of, what better kind of challenge than a global pandemic to remind us that there's some things that cannot be solved at an individual level, and there's something really profound about living through that.
I just wonder if Snapchat, just came at the wrong time. We basically need Snapchat right now. That's the problem. It's not that Zoom is here. It is that Snapchat went away, because that's what allowed for this. I mean, I have this weird thing where because I administer our Zoom channel or our Zoom account, I keep getting these emails of like, oh yeah, somebody has joined, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, actually I should just join in and see what's going on. And I actually want to set that up and just go, here's my public Zoom. Anyone in the world, just jump on. Let's see what's going on. Sometimes it's what IRC used to be for those kids who are listening to this. I'm the old guy. This used to be a technology like the rotary telephone. IRC was that. You jumped into a channel and you were like, what's going on? And Discord kind of does that a little bit. We just haven't figured out how to do that for Zoom yet. Maybe.
I've had a couple of magic moments like that where I'm a musician, and we've been some of my jam partners. We've been using an online jam system, and one of them is called Jam Kazam, and it's great because you can go into you can set up an open Zoom, an open jam. And so I was like one of the first nights I set it up, I just kind of went in there to try it out, and I met like a guitarist from New Jersey, and we started playing like a blues song, and then another guy just randomly jumped in the middle and did a sax solo and then jumped out. It was like a profound kind of moment of coming together and like creative collaboration and just like the openness of feeling like here I'm like, we're getting a drummer from this place and a singer from this place, and the fluidity of way people could jump in and out. It was a really wonderful moment.
But maybe that's the thing, right? That just needs to be popularized more. And maybe then we get into the real conversation of, are we humans together? Because right now we're still humans very separately. And I want that sense of like, jump in, let me learn a little bit about you. I still don't want to touch you, but
Some things will never change about interaction. But yeah, that's I think you guys have both talked about that. And that is the thing I think we need to solve next is, the people have described the way we enter Zoom meetings as being violent, because you just jump into a room. And I've been on so many, I watched a talk the other night, at the Brooklyn Public Library virtually. And I was in a breakout session where most people had their cameras off because people are still introverted, still only want to maybe listen and participate that way. And they're not sure they want to be fully present in that meeting. And then you hear people going, please turn on your cameras. And you're like, no, some people like to experience these kinds of things differently. They are the people who would sit at the back of the room. So if we could please introduce that into the way we're interacting this way, where there is sort of there's like a liminal space. There's this like a sort of a moment where you're hanging out at the threshold, evaluating the room. And I know Toshi's talked about this. I know we've all talked about this. I guess maybe that's the assignment as we wrap up this podcast is like, okay, how can we make this feel more like you're saying, where people can just sort of hear what's going on in another room and decide whether or not they want to bring their full self into that room. And then that's the moment that we all also want, is we want to be able to safely feel like we can express ourselves, share some vulnerability, connect and communicate, and then propagate stories from there. So
can I throw one idea in there for that?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, solve it.
Well, I mean, this has been my completely crappy way of attempting to solve for it. I don't like a wall behind me. And what that causes is my girlfriend ends up randomly walking through stuff. And I've had this situation a few times. One of our partners who was in a different town was like, it's kind of funny. Like at the same time, every time in our call, there's this like random woman that walks behind you. And I was like, that actually was a beautiful moment for me. And everyone else was like, oh my God, like, let's like not have her walk. And I was like, no. You're already in my life. I'm sorry, you came into my house. This is my house. I need more stuff here. And people keep apologizing for the children that show up and the cats and whatever else. And I'm like, no, man, this is it. We're here. Let's make that the norm, not let me like have my hair looking good and all this.
Yeah. Carefully curated, limited.
Having the next step of like, can we actually talk to human beings instead of in a structured way?
To that point, really quick, one of the most profound things about our conference this year was that we knew when people would be at home and potentially with their families. And we knew the conference was going to be more geographically distributed this year than ever. What we didn't know was going to be generationally distributed. People are sitting there. It's one thing to fly to a futurist conference and wear a suit and go. It's another thing to sit there with your kids on the other side of the room thinking about the future. And I think that's going to be transformative in terms of people going back to the human kind of origins of being in context of your family and recognizing that people are part of families. Like that's a big thing that's been missing, that now we're getting kind of a peak and people are kind of in that with each other.
Yeah, I hope this is a very humanizing moment for technology design. Like how can we use this stuff to create that kind of connection? So yeah, and that kind of meaning. So yeah, wow. All right. Well, there's so much to think about. Clearly, we need to do a continuation of this conversation. But I am so grateful to you both for joining me for this. This is, I don't know, so thought provoking. Thank you. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Kirsten.
Actually, thanks for introducing me to Sundar too.
Yay! Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
That global connection, that physical global connection. Ta-da. Yeah, that was fun.
It would never have happened if it hadn't been for COVID. No, sorry.
Well, it was anyway. Okay, right. All right. Well, thank you guys.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Tide Generator podcast, produced by Avixa. Find it wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you next time.